The Winchester rifle fired loudly on the dusty platform, and Thomas McKinnon fell onto the broken wooden planks, not even having time to see who had fired. Blood flowed from his temple, and the locomotive let out a piercing whistle, drowning out the chaos that had erupted around the tiny station of Redemption Creek in Arizona Territory. "Welcome to paradise, stranger," growled a voice from behind a water barrel. "I hope you brought a coffin with you." Thomas pressed his face against the rough boards, tasting the alkaline dust and his own blood with a hint of copper. This was not how he had imagined his arrival. For 3 months he had carried Rebecca Morrison's letters in his breast pocket, each one promising him a new life in an untouched wilderness where honest people could build something lasting. Her elegant handwriting painted pictures of rolling hills dotted with cattle, a thriving community church, and a general store in need of an experienced accountant from the East. The reality, however, was a festering wound of shattered dreams. Another shot rang out, shattering the depot sign above his head. Thomas rolled behind a rusty trough, his best traveling suit now covered in mud and manure. Through the settling dust, he saw Redemption Creek for the first time. The main street was nothing more than a scar cut between dilapidated buildings, leaning against each other like drunken cowboys. The paint peeled from the fake shop windows like scabs, exposing the sun-bleached wood. The thriving church Rebecca had mentioned was a collapsed structure of charred wood, its steeple rising like a black skeleton against the merciless sky. "You picked a hell of a day to visit our little paradise," came a woman's voice, rough as saddle leather, but unmistakably authoritative. "You'd better stay put until Silas and his boys are done with their business." Thomas peered out of the trough and saw a figure emerging from the shadows of the depot's canopy. She was wearing an old raincoat that had seen better days, and her gray hair was pulled back into a strict bun under a worn hat. But what struck him most was the sheriff's star pinned to her chest, dull and tarnished, but undoubtedly genuine. "Are you Rebecca Morrison?" Thomas shouted, though his heart had already stopped. This elderly woman was twice the age of the fragile girl who had written him letters. The woman's laughter sounded like gravel in a tin bucket. "Rebecca Morrison has been in the ground for 6 months, son. Tuberculosis took her just after Christmas. I'm Martha Morrison, her mother-in-law. And if you're not going to run back to the train, we need to have a serious talk." The locomotive was already pulling away, leaving behind a black plume of smoke that looked like a funeral ribbon. Thomas watched as his chance for salvation disappeared around the bend in the canyon, taking with it any hope of a quick return to civilization. Another volley of gunfire rang out from the saloon across the street. Through the open doors, Thomas saw flashes of gun barrels and heard the crash of furniture being smashed. Martha Morrison spat into the dust and glanced at her pocket watch. "Silas Carmichael is fighting with his business partners again," she explained casually, as if discussing the weather. "It happens every Tuesday, like clockwork. The man thinks he owns this town just because he has the only bar within 50 miles. Thomas struggled to his feet, shaking his coat with trembling hands. There was no mention of shootouts, dead brides, or female sheriffs in the letters. Rebecca's elegant handwriting promised a respectable woman seeking a God-fearing husband to help her build a decent home. Instead, he found himself in a situation reminiscent of the finale of a Greek tragedy. "I don't understand," he said, barely audible over the continuing gunfire. "Rebecca wrote to me just a month ago. She said what you needed to hear," Martha interrupted, studying him with gray eyes as intense as a hawk assessing its prey. "Just like I wrote what you needed to hear after her death. The town needs fresh blood, and you looked promising in that daguerreotype you sent. Clean-shaven, educated, all your teeth. You can't say that about most of the vagrants who pass through our town." This revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had fallen in love with a ghost, courted a shadow, traveled 2,000 miles to marry a woman who had been feeding the worms for 6 months. The beautiful future he had imagined for himself collapsed like a house of cards in a hurricane. "You lied to me," he whispered, fumbling in his coat pocket for the train schedule. "The next train east." "Not for another 3 weeks," Martha said in a businesslike tone. "And that's if the Apaches don't tear up more tracks between here and Tucson. You're stuck here, boy, whether you like it or not." There was a deafening crash from the saloon, followed by screams and shouts. Through the settling smoke, Thomas saw men stumbling in the street, some with bottles in their hands, others with fresh wounds. In the center of the group, a bear of a man in a black vest was waving his fists, his mustache perfectly waxed despite the chaos around him. "That's Silas," said Martha, reaching for the revolver at her hip. "He owns the Silver Dollar Saloon and considers himself the king of the mountain. Ever since the town council pinned this star on my chest, he's been trying to drive me out of office." Thomas watched with fascination as Silas Carmichael surveyed his domain like a conqueror. The man's eyes were pale blue, like winter ice, and seemed to absorb every detail of the dusty street, including the stranger lurking behind the feed trough. "You there!" Silas shouted, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "New face! Come out into the light so I can get a good look at you." Martha squeezed Thomas's hand. "Do as he says, but don't open your mouth and keep your hands where I can see them. Silas is quick to anger and vengeful." Thomas emerged from his makeshift hiding place, acutely aware of how ridiculous he looked in his city clothes. His wool suit and polished boots gave him away as clearly as a sign that said, "Eastern Novice." Silas Carmichael's loud laughter echoed through the street. "Damn it! Martha, you didn't say you were expecting guests. This isn't the man you've been corresponding with, is it?" The blood drained from Thomas's face. How did the saloon owner know about his personal correspondence with Rebecca? Martha squeezed his hand tighter. "News travels fast in a small town," she said quietly, "especially when the postmaster owes Silas money for drinks." Silas headed toward them, his boots clattering on the hard ground, his steps measured, like a man accustomed to being obeyed. His followers fanned out behind him like a pack of wolves, baring their teeth and struggling to contain their fury. "Thomas McKinnon," Silas called out, proving that he knew much more about Thomas than the latter would have liked. "An accountant from Philadelphia. Lost your job when the bank went bankrupt. Your family died of fever. No prospects, no future. Is that right?" Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. Every personal detail he had revealed in his letters to Rebecca had somehow found its way to this dangerous stranger. He felt exposed, vulnerable, like a rabbit caught in a field by circling hawks. "Cat got your tongue, Thomas?" Silas continued, coming so close that Thomas could smell the whiskey on his breath. "Or are you just disappointed with what you found? Rebecca was a real beauty, wasn't she? Too bad she died of tuberculosis. Of course, Martha isn't exactly ugly, if you squint and the light hits her at the right angle." Martha stepped forward, placing herself between Thomas and Silas. Although she was at least 5 feet shorter and 50 pounds lighter than the saloon owner, she stood with the quiet confidence of someone who had looked danger in the eye more than once and lived to tell the tale. "That's enough, Silas," she said, in an even voice with a steely edge. "The boy just got off the train. Let him settle in before you start stirring up trouble." Silas's pale eyes remained fixed on Thomas's face. "Problems? Martha, I'm just being a good neighbor, welcoming a new resident to our lovely town. Unless, of course, Mr. McKinnon plans to leave town on the next train." It was clearly a test, though Thomas didn't understand the rules or what was at stake. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and he felt the eyes of everyone watching from the doors and windows along the street on him. Thomas began, his voice trembling like a teenager's. He cleared his throat and tried again. "I came here to start a new life. Circumstances may have changed, but that doesn't mean I'm ready to give up." Martha's smile was barely noticeable, but Thomas saw it. Silas, however, looked less pleased with the answer. "A new life," the saloon owner repeated slowly. "That's really admirable, Thomas. It takes courage to start over in a country like this. Of course, you also need to know who your friends are, and who your enemies might be." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Thomas felt himself being drawn into a conflict he didn't understand, with risks he couldn't imagine. All he wanted was a quiet life with a good woman, maybe a little land he could call his own, and the chance to build something lasting. "Speaking of friends," Martha said, trying to sound casual but remaining alert, "Thomas might be interested to know about a little agreement we have in this town. You see, Thomas, Silas owns the saloon, which means he controls the liquor trade. I wear a badge, which means I have to keep order. Sometimes those two duties don't quite coincide." Silas laughed coldly. "Martha is being modest. In fact, we have a delicate balance in Redemption Creek. She keeps the vagrants and troublemakers in check, and I make sure the workers can spend their wages. It's what you might call a symbiotic relationship." Thomas sensed that there was more to this story than either of them was revealing. The tension between Martha and Silas crackled like lightning before a storm, and he began to realize that his arrival had somehow disrupted the balance they had managed to establish. "There's something else you should know," Martha said, her gray eyes fixed on Silas, "about why I needed you to come to Redemption Creek so badly. You see, Rebecca left behind 3 children. Now they're orphans, with no one but me, and I'm 62 years old, too old to raise children on my own." The last piece of the puzzle fell into place, and Thomas felt the trap closing around him. He had been lured here not as a husband for a living woman, but as a guardian for 3 orphans and a partner for their aging guardian. The deception was complete and masterful. "Where are they?" he asked quietly. Martha nodded toward a small adobe house behind the general store. "They're hiding until the shooting stops. Jenny is the oldest, 12 years old, smart as a squirrel, but wild as a March hare. The twins, Billy and Sam, are 8, and they're worse than a pack of rattlesnakes. They're all good kids, but they need a man's authority." Silas smiled predatorily. "A touching story, isn't it, Thomas? Of course, raising 3 children isn't cheap. You need money for food, clothes, school. Fortunately for you, I might have a job for a man with your skills. Books don't pay themselves, and I have business interests that require proper accounting." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Thomas instinctively understood that agreeing would mean choosing sides in the war brewing between Martha and Silas. Refusal could mean starvation in a town where there were very few opportunities for an educated Eastern man. Before he could answer, a soft voice spoke from behind him. "Aunt Martha, is that him? Is that the man who's going to be our new daddy?" Thomas turned and saw 3 children emerging from the shadows of the general store. The girl, Jenny, had inherited the delicate features of her late mother, but her eyes betrayed a wariness that spoke of a life too hard for such a young child. The twin boys were mirror images of mischief, covered in freckles and bursting with energy. Their appearance struck Thomas more deeply than any of Silas's veiled threats. These weren't abstract concepts or problems to be solved. These were real children who had lost everything and were looking to him for salvation, which he wasn't sure he could give them. "Well," Silas said quietly, "it looks like the welcoming committee has arrived. What are you going to do, Thomas McKinnon? Will you make these children's dreams come true? Or will you break their hearts like so many other promises in this God-forsaken place?" Thomas knew that the choice had been made the moment he stepped off the train. There was no turning back, no escape from the tangled web of obligations and deceit that had brought him here. He was trapped in Redemption Creek, caught between a sheriff with secrets and a saloon owner with ambitions, responsible for 3 orphans and bound by a promise to a dead woman. The sun was setting behind the canyon walls, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. A coyote howled in the distance, and Thomas McKinnon wondered if he had stepped into a new life or his own grave. The story of Redemption Creek was just beginning, and Thomas was about to discover that some prisons are not made of bars and walls, but of love, duty, and the weight of other people's expectations. When the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Martha Morrison gently placed her hand on his shoulder. "Welcome to the family, son," she said softly. "I hope you're ready for the journey of a lifetime." If you enjoyed this story about the Old West, subscribe to our channel to see more stories about life on the frontier, lost dreams, and unexpected family ties. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and share stories about your ancestors who bravely took on the Wild West. Their courage and struggle deserve to be remembered.